Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. Today, we're heading to the Ardennes Forest in Belgium and Luxembourg on December 16, 1944, the day Germany launched its final major offensive of World War II, which would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. And I need to tell you up front, this episode is personal. My father was a combat infantryman in the 102nd Ozark Infantry Division, and he fought in this battle. So when I talk about soldiers enduring brutal winter conditions, holding lines against overwhelming odds, making sacrifices that saved the war, I'm talking about men like my father. Understanding what happened in those frozen forests teaches us something profound about courage, about the cost of freedom, and about what ordinary people can endure when everything depends on them not breaking. Picture this. It's just before dawn on December 16, 1944. American soldiers are positioned along an 85-mile front in the Ardennes Forest, a supposedly quiet sector where exhausted units recover and green troops get their first taste of combat. The war seems nearly won. Paris is liberated. Allied forces are pushing toward Germany. Christmas is 9 days away, and soldiers are hoping for a few days of relative peace. Then at 5:30 a.m., the forest erupts. German artillery, over 1,600 guns, opens fire simultaneously. For 90 minutes, shells rain down on American positions. Then, out of the morning fog, come German tanks and infantry. Over 200,000 German soldiers, supported by 1,400 tanks and tank destroyers, are pouring through the Ardennes. It's the largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940, and it catches the Americans almost entirely by surprise. The men in those foxholes, combat infantrymen, like my father, they had no warning. One moment, they're trying to stay warm in frozen forests. The next moment, they're under the most intense artillery barrage many of them will ever experience, followed by waves of German armor and infantry. Here's the thing that I always wonder about. What goes through your mind in that first moment? When the shelling starts and you realize this isn't a raid or a probe, this is a major attack. When you see German tanks coming through the fog and you're in a foxhole with a rifle, what does it take not to run? What does it take to hold the line? Let me build the clock for you, because understanding what the Battle of the Bulge was and what it cost the men who fought it requires examining both the strategic situation and the human experience of combat in winter conditions that tested the absolute limits of endurance. Think about it this way. Hitler was desperate. By December 1944, Germany was losing the war. The Soviets were crushing them from the east. The Western Allies had landed in France and were pushing toward Germany. Hitler had one chance: split the Allied armies, drive to Antwerp, and capture the vital port, force the Americans and British to negotiate. It was a desperate gamble. But from Hitler's perspective, it was the only play left. Here's what the evidence tells us. The Germans planned brilliantly. They attacked through the Ardennes because the Allies thought it was impassable to armor. The same mistake the French made in 1940. They attacked in winter when the weather grounded Allied aircraft. They achieved complete surprise, and initially they achieved remarkable success, punching a deep bulge into Allied lines. Hence the name Americans gave the battle. But the plan required speed. The Germans needed to reach Antwerp before Allied reinforcements could arrive and before they ran out of fuel. German tanks were already operating on captured Allied gasoline. Every hour of resistance by American forces mattered, every crossroads held, every town defended, every bridge denied to German armor, all of it bought time. Think about what this meant for the men on the ground. Combat infantrymen like my father weren't thinking about grand strategy. They were in foxholes, frozen, exhausted, facing German tanks and veteran SS units. They were holding positions. After all, their officers told them to hold because the men next to them were holding, because someone had to stop the Germans from breaking through. I find myself thinking about what my father experienced. The 102nd Infantry Division, the Ozark Division, they were a part of the 9th Army defending the northern shoulder of the Bulge. These were men from the Ozarks, farm boys and small-town kids, most of them in combat for the first time, and they held against veteran German units, against tanks, against artillery, in weather that was killing men as surely as bullets. They held. Now here's where my investigator's training becomes crucial, because the Battle of the Bulge reveals something important about what determines outcomes in war, and it's not always superior weapons or numbers. The evidence shows that American units, even when surrounded or outnumbered, fought with extraordinary tenacity. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne refused to surrender when surrounded. At St. Vite, the 7th Armored Division held a critical road junction for 6 days against overwhelming odds. All along the line, units that should have collapsed held just long enough to disrupt German timetables. Why? Not because Americans were supermen, but because of training, leadership, and something harder to quantify, the knowledge that if they broke, the war could be lost. The Germans were betting that American soldiers, most of them conscripts, would break under pressure. They were wrong. Think about the conditions these men fought in. The winter of 1944 to 45 was the coldest in decades. Temperatures dropped to 0 degrees Fahrenheit and below. Snow was waist deep, foxholes filled with icy water. Soldiers developed trench foot, their feet literally rotting from constant cold and moisture. They couldn't build fires because German snipers would target the smoke. They couldn't get hot food. Many had inadequate winter gear, and they fought like this for weeks. The casualty rates tell the story. In the Battle of the Bulge, over 19,000 Americans were killed, 47,000 wounded, and 23,000 captured or missing. The Germans lost over 100,000 casualties. But the Americans held. They absorbed the German offensive, bent but didn't break, and then counterattacked. By early January, the Bulge was being squeezed from both sides. By late January, American forces had pushed the Germans back to their starting positions. Hitler's last gamble had failed, and it cost Germany men, tanks, and aircraft that they couldn't replace. After the Bulge, Germany was fighting a purely defensive war until its surrender in May. We're still learning from what happened in those frozen forests, and I think this is where the story becomes especially relevant for us. Right now, look at what the Battle of the Bulge teaches us about resilience, about not breaking under pressure, about the importance of individual courage when everything seems lost. Here's what fascinates me. The Americans were surprised. Intelligence failed. We didn't see the attack coming. The Germans achieved numerical superiority at the point of attack. Weather grounded our air support. Everything that could go wrong did. And still, the Americans held. Why does this matter now? Because we're facing our own challenges, different challenges, but ones that test our resilience. Economic uncertainty, political division, global instability, climate change, pandemics. And the lesson from the Bulge is this: When things look darkest, when you're surprised and outnumbered and cold and scared, that's when character matters most. Think about it. Those combat infantrymen in the Ardennes, men like my father, didn't sign up to be heroes. They were drafted, trained, and sent to war. They didn't particularly want to be in frozen foxholes being shelled by German artillery. But when the moment came, when everything depended on them holding the line, they held. That's not superhuman. That's human. That's ordinary people doing extraordinary things because the alternative is unacceptable. The pattern shows up in crisis after crisis. 9/11's first responders running into burning towers. Essential workers during the pandemic are staying on the job. People in communities devastated by disasters helping their neighbors rebuild. The same quality that kept men in foxholes at the Bulge shows up whenever ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances. Here's what troubles me. We seem to have lost some appreciation for this kind of quiet courage. We celebrate flash and celebrity, but we don't always honor the people who just do their duty when it's hard. Combat infantrymen don't get victory parades. They get frostbite and trauma and memories they can't talk about. But they do it anyway because someone has to. I find myself thinking about my father's generation, the men who fought at the Bulge and across Europe and the Pacific. They came home, went to work, raised families, and mostly didn't talk about what they'd done. They didn't think of themselves as heroes. They thought they'd done their job. That humility, that sense of duty without demanding recognition, that's something we could use more of. Think about the position we're in as a society. We face challenges that require sacrifice and resilience. Climate change will require us to change our behaviors, accept costs, and plan for the long term. Democracy requires us to engage even when it's difficult, to accept results we don't like, to work with people we disagree with. These aren't life or death struggles like the Bulge, but they require similar qualities: resilience, duty, and willingness to endure discomfort for a larger purpose. Can we do it? The men at the Bulge would say yes, because humans, when they have to, can endure almost anything. The question is whether we'll choose to endure before we're forced to. So as we think about that frozen December morning in 1944, when German shells started falling on American positions and men like my father had to decide whether to run or hold, I think the question for us isn't about military tactics or grand strategy. The question is about what makes people have the line when everything in them wants to run. I know something of what my father experienced because he eventually talked about it, though not much and not often: the cold, the fear, the friends who didn't make it, the impossible choice between advancing toward danger or staying in a foxhole while your buddies advanced. The weight of a rifle felt impossibly heavy after days without sleep. The knowledge that your survival depended as much on luck as skill. He held the line. Thousands of men like him had the line. They held it because their training kicked in, because their officers and sergeants kept them together. After all, the man next to them was holding, and they couldn't let him down. They had it because if they didn't, the Germans might break through, might reach Antwerp, might extend the war by months or years. Here's what the investigator in me sees. The Battle of the Bulge was won not by brilliant generalship, though Patton's Third Army wheeling north to relieve Bastogne was impressive, but by individual soldiers making individual choices to stay and fight. Strategy matters. Logistics matter. But in the end, wars are won or lost by individual humans deciding whether to hold or break. Think about what we owe to those men. My father came home. Many didn't. Of those who came home, many carried wounds, physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. They gave us the freedom we enjoy, the prosperity we've built, and the peace that let our generation grow up without having to fight a world war. And what did they ask in return? Nothing. They did their job. They came home. They moved on. That's the character they built. That's what they took with them when they left this earth. Not wealth or fame, but the knowledge that when it mattered most, they'd done the right thing. I always come back to my core principle. Do the right thing and make your parents proud. My father did that in the Ardennes Forest. He held the line when men were falling around him, when the cold was as deadly as the Germans, when everything in him probably wanted to run. He held because that was his duty. He held because his buddies were holding. He held because someone had to. That's character. That's what matters. That's what we should remember and honor, not just on anniversaries, but always. The great philosopher George Santayana once wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And here's why that matters today. The Battle of the Bulge teaches us that freedom isn't free, that democracy requires defending, that resilience and courage in ordinary people, combat infantrymen like my father, are what ultimately determine whether civilization survives or falls. We face challenges now that test our resilience differently. Not German tanks in winter forests, but threats to democracy from within. Challenges that require sacrifice for the common good. Crises that demand we hold the line even when it's hard. If we cannot remember what men like my father endured to defend freedom, the cold, the fear, the sacrifice, we're condemned to lose what they preserved. The question isn't whether we face threats. The question is whether we have the character to hold the line when it matters. The way they did on that frozen December morning in 1944. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow, we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, think about what it means to hold the line when everything tells you to run, to do your duty without demanding recognition, and to build the kind of character that my father's generation showed in the Ardennes. Because that's what the Battle of the Bulge teaches us. Not just about military history, but about the ordinary courage that preserves civilization. To my father and all the men of the 102nd Infantry Division, and to every soldier who held the line at the Bulge, we remember, we honor your service, and we're grateful beyond words.